And so the outgoing message for our former climate czar, John Kerry. Outgoing message. We're on the cusp of an exciting time in human history. We're about to undergo a green transformation that will dwarf the Industrial Revolution, says John Kerry, man of science and data.
This will be expensive to make the transition through investment. No country in the world has enough money to do this by itself. But if we mobilize the private sector into infrastructure, new grids, water treatment facilities, transportation, laying down the power lines and so forth, those are jobs. Those are jobs for electricians and heavy equipment operators and plumbers and steel workers and so forth. And so this is a moment of looking at the greatest economic transition that is potential there if we seize the baton and we go do it. And it is larger even than the Industrial Revolution transformation that took place in the 1800s and early 1900s. That's our possibility. And there's no question in my mind that if we do what we know how to do and what we promised to do, we will actually make the world, let me stop myself and just put one thing in front of you. Currently, 7 million people are dying around the world every year because of pollution, because of the bad air quality. That's greenhouse gas pollution, folks. We know what we have to do. It's the burning of fossil fuel and not capturing it, the emissions, that is the problem. So we don't need a new algorithm defined. We don't need a rocket scientist to define what's the problem. We know what the problem is. It's simple. It's us. The choices we make about how we light our homes, our factories, power our vehicles, and so forth.
We know what the problem is. We're the problem.
Get rid of people.
I
Life without people. I love it. It's the environmentalist dream.
Save
Life
the planet for who? Right. And to that end, the EU, of course, is fully bought into this degrowth strategy. The farm to fork strategy, this is what is in part driving all the protests you've seen from European farmers. The
French dairy farmers outside the gates of Paris, yes.
The strategic goals for the EU: reduce farmland by 10%, fertilizer by 20%, and pesticides and antimicrobials by 50%, which would reduce total EU ag production by at least 12%, and then obviously force importation may also have an impact on the global food supply that would be negative. But
I can't get decent brie now in American brie.
Well, there are going to have to be some sacrifices if we're going to get to net zero by 2050. That's what I always say. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus think tank, author of Best Things First. Bjorn, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan, it's great to be back.
John Kerry is a noted man of science and data. I know that because he says so. What do you think of that dissertation?
Well, look, there is a problem with global warming, but it should worry you when he's basically selling it as, yes, this is going to be fantastically costly. It's going to be bigger than the Industrial Revolution. And if we succeed, we will have exactly what we have today. We will have plentiful energy that's cheap and available, but only if we've spent a fortune. That's a really, really hard sell because we already have that today. Now, we do need to fix eventually the climate problem, but you're not going to fix it by throwing trillions. And we are literally talking about many, many trillions of dollars each and every year. On average, over the 21st century, it's estimated we'll have to spend about $27 trillion a year. Just for reference, the current global GDP is about $100 trillion. So we're talking about spending an unfathomable amount of money on getting this transformation. That's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen in rich countries like the US and the EU because we can't afford it. But of course, it's not going to happen at all in China, India, and Africa, which are the places where most of the emissions are going to come from the 21st century. So we really need to find a smarter and better way than this, just let's spend all the money we have and a lot of the money we don't have.
And while they're figuring that out, the EU is seems intent on dealing a pretty sizable body blow to its agribusiness sector. I've seen data that suggests that if the EU had zero emissions, it would make a 0.13 degrees Celsius difference in global climate by 2100. So, I mean, it's just like the expenditures and the sacrifices and the transformations. And what's the payoff again?
It's fairly small. You need to get a realization this is not about what rich countries do by themselves. I mean, we can basically make ourselves as poor as we want to. It's not going to fix climate change unless we get China, India, and Africa on board. And they, quite frankly, have much bigger and much more important issues like getting their populations out of poverty, making sure that they actually achieve some of the things that we have now achieved over the last 200 years with the Industrial Revolution. It's not surprising that they want to have enough food, they want to have enough opportunity, that they want to have easy, cheap, and reliable access to energy and electricity. And so we really have to say this is not about making everyone poorer or worse off, because that's never going to work. This has to be about innovation. It's always been about innovation. That's how we've solved big problems in the world in the past, and this is how we're going to solve climate change. We need to spend a lot more resources on research and development because that's cheap and that's effective, and it'll probably have a lot of other benefits. But we're talking, tens of billions of dollars in cost rather than what we're talking about with climate policy, which is tens of trillions of dollars, which nobody can afford.
Well, the other thing that Kerry does that's, so annoying, but it's just what these politicians do, is they give you one data point that doesn't include any trade-offs. So 7 million people die from pollution-related illnesses. I don't know if that statistic is true or not, but 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and we know that if we're not using those natural resources to power an economy and to provide heat and air conditioning and all of the other amenities of the modern world, even in the developing world, then you're going to have a body count that is exponentially higher than that. And so we never get it's the same thing we did during COVID. We pretend we can live in a world without trade-offs.
Yes, and we actually live in a world with trade-offs. So the statistic is correct that a lot of people die from air pollution from fossil fuels. But remember, many more people die from not having enough access to energy. So the reality here is, if, for instance, we didn't have fossil fuels, about 4 billion people, not million, but billion people are right now reliant on our synthetic fertilizer. So if we didn't have gas to produce that, basically 4 billion people would be dying. So we really need to remember that most of our infrastructure today is set up with fossil fuels. As you mentioned, it's about 80% of all energy that comes from fossil fuels. Now, again, it makes sense to try to aim for a society where we have lower use of fossil fuels, because CO2 does lead to global warming, which in the long run will have a net negative impact. But there are trade-offs. Making people much, much poorer in order to achieve that is actually going to leave everyone much worse off. A new estimate of the total cost and benefit of going net zero by 2050 estimates that the net benefit over the 21st century will be about $4.5 trillion in benefits. So that's real, and that's something we should take into account. But the net cost, as I mentioned before, is $27 trillion. So we're going to be spending $7 for every $1 of benefit. That's a really bad deal. And of course, one that you won't get most populations to accept when their politicians try to latch on to net zero.
Well, who benefits? Who benefits from
Well,
all this spending? Who benefits from?
There's a lot of,
Yeah, who are the beneficiaries?
Well, we're essentially creating a whole new subsidized industry. So obviously people who produce solar and wind, people who produce electric cars. Again, remember, electric cars are fun and great for some things, but requiring everyone to buy them when the vast majority of people actually don't want them necessitate that you spend a lot of money on subsidies, and then you also eventually talk about forcing people to just move over to an electric car by telling you can't have the gas or diesel operated car that you want. So we're essentially creating a whole new economy of subsidies. That was what you heard John Kerry talk about, all these jobs that are going to be provided. Well, right. If these jobs are provided with subsidies that you then have to tax other people to pay for, ultimately that end up making you poor. You are not richer by subsidizing people. Now, there is a real issue here, but again, subsidizing your way out of it is just not affordable even for rich countries. We've seen that in Germany very clearly, and obviously not a solution at all for China, India, and Africa.
Well, the other thing too is, I mean, talking about what the ROI will be, or the potential negative impacts will be in 2050 or 2100. I mean, you know, the modeling and the studies, many of them have not exactly held up to scrutiny over the previous generations in terms of predicting 20 or 30 or 40 years ago where we'd be today. So, you know, it seems to me even those models that are telling us where we'll be in 30 years if we do X or we do Y, or 75 years. I mean, I don't know how much stock we should put in those either.
No, I mean, I take your sort of skepticism, and there has been a lot of really bad predictions about what would happen. You know, we're going to run out of forest, and we're going to run out of oil and aluminum and whatever you want. There's been a lot of these bad forecasts. The estimates that I'm talking about are not actually those kinds of predictions that that rely on exaggeration. But fundamentally, if you see the temperature veer off from what it used to be, you're going to have costs because we've built our infrastructure to the current climate. And so it's likely that we will have, in a future that's warmer, we'll have lower heating costs, which is great, especially for people living in northern regions, but we'll have higher cooling costs. We'll have a different set of infrastructure that we'll need to build. That'll have cost. It won't be the end of the world by any means, but it will be, reasonably costly, and that's what they're modeling. But I think we need to wake up to the fact that the policies we're trying to follow in order to deal with this are going to be much, much more expensive. So essentially, we're saying let's pay a lot more for the cure than the original ailment would have cost us, and that's a bad deal.
He is Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus think tank, author of Best Things First as well. Bjorn, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you guys.
And Bjorn Lomborg joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
As a local business owner, you get called every week by marketing companies. We get it. We have hundreds of satisfied customers. Here's what a satisfied client recently said.
Open enrollment is going great. We're hitting record numbers. Thank you so much for this report. It really is amazing to see how the marketing is really shaping our enrollment around the city.
If you're a local business and ready for the next step, visit surroundchicago.com right now. Our experts are ready to help you take your marketing to the next level. Visit surroundchicago.com today.
Have you saved enough